So I really didn't.
Sorry.
Thank you. It's, she's new to Northeastern, so I really have not met her, but I'm very pleased to have just spent a couple of minutes chatting with her. Kaitlyn Alvarez Noli is an assistant professor of public policy and health sciences at Northeastern. The talk she's giving is about farm worker health and environmental justice, the perils of pesticide-intensive agriculture. Kaitlyn, sorry.
No worries.
Kaitlyn will discuss adverse impacts of pesticide-intensive agriculture has on farm worker communities. Drawing on over 2 years of ethnographic fieldwork, she will explore the challenges of addressing this entrenched environmental justice issue and will share the testimonies of farm workers who bear the brunt of pesticide exposure and pesticide-related injuries and illness. She dedicates her research to inspiring change in communities that are disproportionately burdened by environmental harm. Her work as an environmental justice scholar confronts the ways local environmental disputes and public debate exclude the interests and concerns of the marginalized groups and explores practices that can counteract this exclusion. Her current line of research examines the power relationships in framing coalition development and advocacy involving farm workers. Her work has appeared in the International Journal of Science and Society and the Journal of Business and Economics and Justice, and Environmental Justice. So let me turn the conversation over to Kaitlyn and welcome her to our group. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neil. Okay, so hello everyone, and thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Neil, for inviting me to participate in this really important program and for that kind introduction. So it really is a pleasure to have this opportunity to present to you in this series on ethical food production, consumption, and policy. As Neil mentioned, will be discussing environmental justice in farm worker communities, and in particular, talking about this in relation to their disproportionate exposure to pesticides used in agricultural production. So the environmental justice movement really stresses that all communities, regardless of socio-demographic makeup, have an equal right to a safe and healthy environment. However, in our country and around the world, environmental hazards such as pesticides, air pollution, water contaminants, and hazardous waste have really disproportionately impacted vulnerable communities, namely those low-income communities, communities of color, indigenous communities, and immigrant communities. This kind of disproportionate impact is called environmental injustice or environmental inequality, or sometimes referred to as environmental racism. In the 1980s, national protests over the discriminatory siting of locally unwanted landmasses really prompted several landmark studies for the environmental justice movement. In the 1983, the US General Accounting Office conducted research that really mapped the siting of toxic landfills. And in 1987, the Commission for Racial Justice sponsored a national study that looked at the relationship between the siting of hazardous waste dumps and the racial makeup of communities where those dumps are sited, and seeing the associations between those. So these kind of environmental justice studies were the first of many subsequent studies that have shown how unequal distribution of environmental burdens across society really results in inequalities and illness and death along these lines of race, class, ethnicity, immigrant status, indigenous status, and other forms of social status. The discriminatory siting of polluting industries, the use of native land to store nuclear waste, unequal patterns of air pollution, the exposure of low-income minority children to lead, these are all examples of environmental justice issues. So my work looks in particular at the disproportionate exposure of farm worker communities to agricultural pesticides as an environmental justice issue as well. So farm workers are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of environmental harms, and this vulnerability has become increasingly visible at the present moment as farm workers face really compounding disasters we've seen through the COVID-19 pandemic, wildfires, drought, heat waves, pesticide exposure, really systemic racism, and this negative reception of Latino immigrants in the labor market has heightened the vulnerability of farm workers to these different disasters and harms. Farm workers are segregated into substandard and close-quartered housing, and they endure labor-intensive working conditions. And they lived this experience that has been really rendered invisible in many ways. They're often characterized as being unworthy of protection. They're stereotyped as illegal, alien, or other, and as temporary, disposable, or cheap labor. And today we can add this term of essential workers to this list. I see this as a term that really allows us to justify the risks that farm workers bear on our behalf. Little bit about the demographics and the status of farm workers in the United States. So United States employers have recruited laborers from Mexico to work in the agricultural industry since the mid-19th century. There are 3 million farm workers working in the US agricultural industry, and there's approximately 68% who immigrate to the US from Mexico. 72% of farm workers are foreign born, and approximately 80% identify as Hispanic or Latino. Many farm workers have low English proficiency and low educational attainment, and they earn far below the federal poverty level, and about half of farm workers are undocumented. And this is really concerning because undocumented immigrants really lack fundamental protections that are provided to residents and citizens, and they aren't empowered even to exercise those limited rights that they are entitled to. And this kind of cumulative injustices really contribute to the impact that pesticide-related harm has, because it makes it harder for farm workers and their families in the community to avoid pesticide exposure. So within the farm worker community, there's also indigenous Mexican farm workers who are disproportionately burdened by occupational hazards. So the majority of farm workers are men originating from West Central Mexico, but 22% of farm workers are female, and at least 20% of farm workers originate from Southern Mexican states where many indigenous Mexicans reside. So, and also according to some farm workers and community leaders that I've spoken with, in particular where I conduct my research in Ventura County, California, the percentage of indigenous Mexican workers is much higher in the strawberry industry. And that's where pesticide use is really intensive, and there's really high labor demands as well. So, one Mistec harvester who I worked with on my research and who works in strawberry production estimated that about 75% of his coworkers were indigenous Mexican immigrants who speak languages such as Mixteco, Zapoteco, and Triqui. So most indigenous Mexican farm workers are working in strawberry production perhaps, and many of them are contracted harvesters, so they're picking the fruit. And that's really the most physically demanding position in agriculture. So for these reasons, indigenous farm workers in particular experience adverse health effects such as back and knee pain, miscarriages, developmental malformations, and in addition to that, premature births. Female farm workers are also disproportionately burdened, and children are disproportionately burdened by hazardous work conditions. Not only are female farm workers paid less than their male counterparts, but they feel more pressure to maintain their jobs in order to care for their children. And this is concerning too, because given the danger of farm work, there's this pressure for them to work even when they're pregnant, and that can really put their children and themselves at high risk. And that kind of brings us to this discussion about the negative health effects of pesticide use. So industrial agriculture, which is our prominent agricultural system, really relies on the intensive use of these synthetic pesticides. And also, as we've been speaking about, the employment of a very vulnerable immigrant workforce. So this results in this creation of low-income Latino immigrant communities that suffer disproportionately high rates of pesticide exposure. And that exposure can cause immediate effects, including headaches, nausea, vomiting, difficulty breathing, respiratory failure, and even death, as well as some more chronic kind of long-term effects to the nervous, endocrine, immune, respiratory, and reproductive systems. And children in particular are at risk for pesticide exposure effects, including things such as birth defects, as well as respiratory and neurological harm at different stages in their development. So in the following slides, I'm drawing on over 2 years of ethnographic fieldwork to kind of share the testimonies that farm workers who bear the brunt of this pesticide exposure have shared, and to discuss the challenges really involved in addressing this particular issue, this injustice. So the data that I collected between 2016 and 2018 includes in-depth interviews with 91 agricultural health stakeholders, such as farm workers, farm worker advocates, growers, pest control advisors, public officials, pesticide regulators, and more. I also engaged in over 200 hours of observation at different meetings and events that were organized by government agencies and community groups. And in addition, I shadowed the work of agency staff with the Department of Pesticide Regulation, as well as the Agricultural Commissioner's Office throughout those 2 years as well. So the kind of my aim when collecting this data was to understand how these stakeholders really address pesticide-related health disparities in their community. And also the goal of that research was to explore stakeholders' positionalities and the way that they kind of make claims, the kind of discursive, rhetorical strategies that they use when they're justifying or challenging pesticide use practices. So a lot of the kind of data that I share and what I learned was in relation to kind of public debate and how, the differing claims that stakeholders have might make it more and more challenging to kind of reconcile those claims and make some change for farm workers. Work has focused in particular on Ventura County, California. California is an important case to kind of understand because of its high pesticide use rates, large concentration of agricultural fields, and also this large pesticide regulatory apparatus, as well as a lot of push to be more green, a large, environmental movement, alternative agricultural movement. So if you think of anywhere could kind of get a handle on mitigating the risks of pesticides, it would be California. And yet we still see a lot of these injustices continue. So it's really an important case. Ventura County, where I conducted the research, is in the southernmost part of California's central coast. And while Ventura County is in the suburbs, it's about 45 minutes away outside of Los Angeles. It's also the site of 2,000 farming operations, 90,000 acres of irrigated cropland. And in 2017, it was also the site of the application of over 6 million pounds of pesticide active ingredients. And the farms applying these pesticides are concentrated in cities that are predominantly Latino, and low income. So the most commonly produced crops in the county include strawberries, lemons, celery, raspberries, avocado, and other kind of luxury crops. Strawberries in particular are kind of, Ventura County is very well known for the production of strawberries. And I'm sorry if you can hear my baby crying in the background. She's a little bit upset, I'm hearing. So it's one of the most pesticide intensive commodities and the most lucrative agricultural crop in the county. And in fact, pesticides used in strawberry production in Ventura County accounted for approximately 45% of all reported pesticide applications. And the top 5 pesticides used in this production are classified as potential carcinogens. And the reason that I bring up kind of the strawberry industry is because many of the farm workers who I interviewed were harvesters for this particular industry. And harvesting strawberries really requires these workers to be stooped over for hours at a time in these toxic and dangerous conditions, right? Because they're being exposed to residues that are on the crop that can, come off into their hands, onto their clothes, that they can then take into their cars, into their homes. But also, as you'll see in some of the photos coming up, the pesticides are applied at all times of production with strawberries, and they can be applied in very close proximity to farm workers. So they're actually kind of directly exposed in some cases, or they're sometimes forced to kind of move through areas that have recently been sprayed, even though that's, going against some of the policies that we have. So the farm workers, right, that I interviewed really share their personal experiences working in these conditions and their kind of embodied experiences being exposed to these chemicals. So the farm workers presented what they call testimonials. These are, testimonies, stories of personal hardships, and they presented these stories at numerous venues. They would share their experience of pesticide exposure with regulators, advocates, and growers at public hearings, with regulators at informational fairs, with advocates during home visits or neighborhood meetings. And then also they would share them during our interviews. So one harvester who has experience picking a variety of different crops explained that when her husband was picking strawberries, all of a sudden he started vomiting a lot. He got dizzy, his head started hurting. It got so bad he had to go to the emergency room. He went to the hospital because his hands became so stiff and he started vomiting. So I heard these stories, and this is a longer story, kind of an excerpt of a longer story about this woman's husband who, was exposed to pesticides, had to go to the emergency room, and just like this was an ongoing, illness that they had to deal with. And these are the kinds of stories that I would hear very frequently during my interviews. Similarly, a former farm worker described how she became acutely ill while picking strawberries. In the interview, she stated, "My face went completely red and everything. I couldn't breathe. I left my box of strawberries and ran to the ponchadora," which is another worker in the field. And she asked me, "What is happening to you?" And I said, "I don't know. I feel like I'm short of breath, like I'm getting dizzy. My head feels really heavy." She called for the foreman, her manager. The man was named Carlos, which is a pseudonym. "Carlos," she said, "Barbara is very red. I don't know what's happening to her. I don't know if it's because of the spray." So these types of stories are very, very common in the interviews and the conversations that I had with farm workers. They also reported a variety of adverse health effects that they linked to pesticide use. Those experiences included dizziness, fainting, nausea, vomiting. They talked about how their eyes and nose and throat were constantly burning when they were working in the field, how they would have stomach aches and they would feel like they would get the flu very frequently. They would feel weak. A lot of them talked about having like racing heart, red hands, excessive skin peeling, nosebleeds. And I heard a lot about birth defects, miscarriages in the fields as well. So a lot of these symptoms are, indications of pesticide exposure. Some of them also can be from heat stress. So just a lot, right, of the experience just of working in the fields is there's just cumulative impacts and hazards that farm workers are dealing with. And they're also really, there's this direct contact with these agricultural chemicals. And in addition to telling stories of their own personal embodied experience with pesticide exposure, farm workers and advocates also told stories about pesticide drift. And they really reported concerns about the close proximity of many of the schools in the area to agricultural fields. So one of the stories that I learned and I heard over and over from many community members is that in November 2000, the hazardous insecticide chlorpyrifos drifted onto Mound Elementary School from an adjacent strawberry field. And this was right when students were arriving for their first classes in the morning. And a lot of the children and the staff who were coming to school really experienced acute pesticide illness and had to be urgently taken to the hospital. So this incident was a long time ago, right? But we still hear about it in the community. And there's still, these stories of other pesticide drift incidents that happen. And also this speculation that a lot of drifts are not reported, especially if they're at elementary schools, unlike Mound elementary schools that are more, have more poor families. This was a kind of upper middle class kind of elementary school where there is a lot more oversight and a lot more political power. But in other areas, right, there's the speculation that there's ongoing low dose kind of exposures and drifts happening that are impacting farm worker children and other low-income children in the communities where there's these agricultural fields. So this incident and others are really an impetus for these ongoing debates about pesticide use in the community and for implementing more mitigation measures around schools. Over the past decades, California has experienced a substantial growth and the extension of the agricultural urban interface. So there's many more kind of sensitive sites that are butting up against agricultural fields. And we have this kind of not the best neighbors, right? To be having sensitive sites where people are living, playing, going to school, being so close to these areas where hazardous chemicals are being sprayed. In 2014, Ventura County was actually ranked #1 in the state of California for the number of schools located within a quarter mile of an agricultural field. And some of the most hazardous pesticides, including various fumigants that are very prone to drift from their application site, are applied on the farmland around the schools in the county. So this has really been an ongoing concern, and especially for farm workers whose children live and go to school in close proximity to the fields. So another story, and this is from my own field notes, is on November 15th, 2016, the Department of Pesticide Regulation held this public hearing regarding proposed regulations that will place restrictions on pesticide use around schools. And this event attracted many different attendees. The agricultural representatives, such as the growers, were very opposed to any additional restrictions on pesticide use near schools. The labor and environmental and social justice advocates really felt that, the proposed regulations were watered down. They did not go far enough. They needed to be more restrictive. And then we had farm workers who really supported the restrictions, and they also went on to kind of explain that they were fearful for their children. And they told their own stories of their children being born with birth defects and suffering from asthma. So one farm worker during this public hearing stated that this coming year, my niece will go to school and I'm scared for her. Many schools are surrounded with fields. The public hearing became antagonistic as opposing sides used portions of their 3-minute comment period to respond to each other, making statements such as, this regulation is meant to satisfy the political agenda of interest groups. And one grower stated, don't bite the hand that feeds you. Don't blame a farmer with a mouthful of food. A farm worker responded to this saying, I think it's farm workers that put the food in your mouths. And a community organizer retorted, does the shaking in my voice sound political to you? This is real feeling. So this is just kind of a look into the type of data that I collected and the kind of public debate and polarization that are occurring across these really key stakeholders around this issue. While this public hearing allowed the Department of Pesticide Regulation to collect data on different stakeholder positions and concerns around pesticide use near schools, it also really reinforced this animosity, and it brought forth some very kind of contradictory claims and made it more difficult, right, for these stakeholders to work together in the upcoming months and years to try to, help farm workers and move forward an agenda that might provide farm workers with more rights. So public debate around the positive and negative consequences of these farming practices have really placed the kind of legitimacy of the established pesticide use practices kind of at the center of discussion. But in addition to these debates about the schools, about, there's these particularly hazardous pesticides that folks are talking about, like fumigants and organophosphates. And then there's local groups that are also looking to address concerns about pesticide exposure during pregnancy. So there's environmental justice advocates in the community that have really mobilized in support of efforts to ban very hazardous chemicals that cause neurodevelopmental harm and that have been proved to do so, in especially for children. And then since children and pregnant women are kind of disproportionately impacted by agricultural applications, we've also seen this call for an implementation of more local initiatives to ensure that pregnant farm workers kind of receive more job status protected pregnancy leave, since they're so vulnerable. And I also heard, through my interviews, this discussion of the experience working in the fields while pregnant and those adverse health impacts as well. One of the farm workers who was at a public hearing and also related this to me in an interview, described how conventional agriculture, she believes, really overuses pesticides. She says, I'm a mother of 4 children. I worked in celery as a farm worker with my 3rd daughter, and she was born with Down syndrome. And she explains how she has 4 daughters and that the other 3 didn't suffer that. And in my interview, she kind of went more in detail with this. And she explained how when she was working in the fields, oftentimes she would be asked to just go into her car, and they would fly over with pesticides, spraying the fields just while she was in the field in a vehicle. And then after they were done spraying, they would go back out and start working in the fields again. And so she really believes that her daughter being born with Down syndrome was linked to those types of exposures that she went through in the field. Of course, a lot of these things aren't reported, and that's one of the challenges to overcoming and addressing injustice. And that's kind of the question that I want to get to next, is why does environmental justice continue? So in my research, I kind of draw on the policy and planning literature on what's called wicked problems. I know that's kind of a funny term, but to answer this question, so in the literature, wicked problems are defined as these kind of complex, ill-structured public problems that are characterized by these high levels of uncertainty between cause and effect, a lot of value conflict among a lot of different stakeholders who are involved. And then they also have this connection with other problems. Another thing about these wicked problems is that there's no one solution, and a lot of the attempted solutions could create new problems. The best solution for one stakeholder group, for example, could really threaten the interests of other groups. So I look at pesticide-related health disparities as being wicked as well. We see these regulatory processes that have been unable to eliminate a lot of scientific uncertainty when it comes to predicting the risks that pesticides pose to human health and the environment. The problem, as you've seen in the previous slides, really involves numerous stakeholders who have diverse worldviews. There's also trade-offs between economic and environmental health benefits and these high levels of value conflict. And just, as we saw in that slide about the polarization between those two groups in the public debate. To touch on first the high level of uncertainty in pesticide risk assessment, it really makes it difficult to evaluate risks and take appropriate actions to mitigate harm. So there's a lot of factors that kind of go into this and impact experts' kind of ability to understand what the risks are and whether someone's experiences or symptoms are linked to pesticide exposure. There's a lot of gaps in knowledge that make it difficult to predict, for example, the effect of low doses of pesticides on human health, as well as the exposure of farm workers to pesticide combinations that are commonly used. So pesticides are oftentimes regulated based on just one pesticide, but farm workers are exposed to pesticides that are applied in combinations, 3 or 4 pesticides applied at the same time, and they're also exposed to many other environmental harms in their communities, because they live in these environmental justice communities where there's many other locally unwanted land uses where there's pollution as well. So it's really hard to pinpoint, what the impact is. There's this cumulative, right, environmental harm that they're dealing with. There's also little understanding about how hormones and receptors in the body will react to pesticide exposure. And what I really found in my research is that there's these various sociodemographic factors that make it difficult to track pesticide illness. Really, it's difficult because there's this underreporting of the pesticide exposures. The things that kind of impact this are poverty, job insecurity, language barriers, and legal status. It really obscures these exposures from the official illness data sets. These are all kind of barriers to reporting. So what I found was that, harvesters, for example, were in constant fear of not being able to provide for their families. And this fear really shaped their decisions and their willingness to report pesticide-related concerns. During a labor forum that I attended, one of the harvesters who was attending explained to kind of a group of other farm workers and regulators that they had only received pesticide training one time during the 10 years that they worked in the strawberry fields. And they're supposed to receive these trainings much more frequently than that. And the public agency employee at that table asked her whether she'd reported this to her foreman, the fact that she had not received the training. And she stated that no, she didn't know her rights and she was scared. She said, "I was scared." Another agency employee responded saying that, they were concerned that some farm workers will say to them that pesticide poisoning is a part of the job. And, the harvester speculated that why some of her peers might say that is because you arrive here with nothing, you work for your check, and it's likely perhaps due to fear. So, similarly, during an interview, when I asked another harvester, which agency they would call to report a pesticide incident, they stated, "I don't know who to talk to. And if you talk, you're afraid that they'll fire you. And it's like better to die or to be there dying." So they really, they oftentimes wouldn't even report the symptoms that they were experiencing to their managers, let alone to report it to, the Department of Pesticide Regulation. Harvesters did, farm workers I did see in some of these meetings, they would report kind of their experiences to who they believe to be regulators, and the regulators would give them their card and say, "Oh, well, I'm so sorry that happened to you. Here's my number, here's my email. You can reach out to me to, discuss this or report this at a later time." So they were speaking up, they were telling their story, but they weren't, using, I guess, the proper channels to be able to report these things in the way that, others who might have more political power would. So really, they oftentimes stay silent when they experience these symptoms, and they really, they talked a lot about their willingness to endure hardship to support their families financially. There was even this kind of tug between them, kind of saying that pesticides actually were a benefit and weren't a benefit because, right, they would talk about how pesticides would increase the yield and allow them to kind of make more money during the season when they're being paid by piece rate pay by how much they could pick, but then they experienced all these symptoms. So they were really kind of torn because they bear the brunt of both, those trade-offs that we'll talk about in a moment, those trade-offs of the, economics, financial gain, and then also the environmental health risks. So another obstacle that came up in relation to negotiating solutions was in relation to this kind of divergent conception of risk, which is really important for this topic. So farm workers, particularly farm worker advocates in particular, tend to adopt what's called the precautionary approach or precautionary risk management approach. So they really argue that the potential for harm should trigger reform, not this kind of not having to actually prove that there's harm before we take some action, but just this potential for harm. So they adhere to this principle, which maintains that in cases of kind of serious or irreversible threats to humans any scientific uncertainty should not be used as a reason to postpone measures to protect human health. On the other hand, agricultural representatives, growers who are really their primary focus is to protect their farm, their economic viability, their farming operation. They tend to adopt a more reactive risk management approach. They kind of argue that we really need this irrefutable evidence of harm, and that should precede any kind of change, any kind of reform in pesticide use practices. And that approach really views health hazards as being quantifiable, and it assumes, right, that we can predict and manage pesticide exposure risks. So our kind of gaps in knowledge and gaps in our scientific approach can be really difficult to work through and can create these lags in reform that can have a really negative impact on marginalized communities. And the current pesticide regulatory framework in the United States is much more reactive than precautionary. The agencies like the EPA, the DPR, which we've been talking about, they often really need to wait for more accurate data before they can take action to prevent harm. And this can lead to action happening after the effects have already occurred. And that's what this quote that I've shared here really gets at. There was this local public official who made this argument that we really can't continue to wait and slowly gather evidence on health effects that treat these groups of people as if they're not worth protecting. And he stated that whole populations become canaries in the mine. One argument is that there's no evidence that the substance is harmful, but the other argument is that things take time to develop. The other approach is that we need to protect people and not treat them as incubators. So advocates' participation in the public debate and policymaking, it has kind of encouraged this movement of government to, implement some regulations and guidelines that can prevent harm, even when there's gaps in knowledge. So there is some opportunity to be more precautionary. And I think that's, the kind of what we need to focus on when it comes to solutions for sure. The last thing that I want to discuss in relation to these challenges is the challenge due to trade-offs between economic and environmental health benefits. So modifying pesticide use, in order to prevent health risks can create other risks and undesired consequences for various groups. Pesticide reform can be costly for growers to implement, can make it harder for them to compete in a global marketplace. That's kind of their argument. And farm workers, as I mentioned, who are really impacted, their health is really impacted, will also bear the brunt of the economic challenges, because as growers go out of business, or if they have difficult years, they might have to lay off seasonal workers, and those layoffs can contribute to farm workers' financial insecurity. So identifying solutions is really difficult, and we have to consider the various adverse effects, both the health and economic effects as well, that impact these groups. So just kind of coming to wrap up, and hopefully we have some time for discussion, just giving these competing demands, these challenges. I've mentioned there's no definitive solution to this injustice. So I'm not arguing for this kind of all or nothing approach to pesticide use. But there are a variety of potential actions that we can take to better protect farm workers. These can range from updating the interpretation of pregnancy leave law to banning particularly hazardous pesticides that are kind of no longer necessary, are very hazardous, are difficult to control. Farm workers are exposed in a variety of different ways, through direct contact with treated soil, through pesticide drifts, inadequate personal protective equipment, and they can also bring residues home on their shoes and clothes and skin. So looking at measures to prevent pesticide-related illness and injury, looking at minimizing opportunities through these different pathways is really important. Providing protective gear. A lot of farm workers that I talked to weren't even provided kind of minimal protective equipment, such as gloves and masks. They oftentimes had to bring their own equipment, such as like makeshift fabric masks to protect themselves. They're often expected to follow a lot of different steps before they can enter their cars and homes. They have to change their clothes and bathe before interacting with their children. They have to launder their work clothes separately from their family's clothes. There's all these steps that they have to take that are pretty infeasible due to the substandard crowded living quarters and limited access to laundry facilities. So, there's ways that we can think through how we can kind of mitigate that, how we can ensure that farmers can decontaminate or, not use such hazardous pesticides that they would have to follow all of these steps to be able to interact with their families, decontaminate before they go home. So there's a lot of different actions. I don't want to go through all of them right now, but there is a lot that can be done. That goes beyond the current regulations. And then also a lot of the existing pesticide use laws are not followed consistently. The violations are really commonplace. So just increasing the enforcement is also important. Some of the growers that I talked to felt kind of, if they were following the regulations, but they felt that they were being under enforced, those regulations were under enforced. And so they actually would appreciate a bit more enforcement when it had to do with competing with those growers who are not following the rules. So they kind of would support some increased enforcement. And lastly, all in all, we need stronger, more precautionary based restrictions, policy, and enforcement to account for the kind of the wicked nature of pesticide health disparities. Many in the community express their concerns with pesticide use, sometimes by thinking through, what should we buy and what should we eat? And while that's really important to think through kind of the kinds of foods that we should be eating or buying, that kind of frame for solving the problem, it kind of frames the problem as being a market-based one that can be kind of fixed through our purchasing decisions. And I don't think that that's really enough, since many consumers can't afford to vote with their dollars. They can't afford to purchase organic foods or to move away from agricultural fields where pesticides are applied. So I think we really need to push for stronger regulations, restrictions to support environmental justice communities. And there's a lot of advocacy organizations that are doing this work that really would, deserve our support. We should be supporting empowering farm workers, the people who are doing that work, and effort to kind of strengthen immigrant rights and labor rights. So there's a lot that we can still do. So I want to leave it at that, and thank you again so much for having me. I hope that you learned something from the talk, and we have a few minutes, I believe, to discuss. And I'll stop the share right now so we can see each other.
Kaitlyn, let me be the first to thank you very much. Very informative, and I must say I think I'm about to go home and throw out all my strawberries. From the, and I'm not making light of it. It really is disturbing. But if I can start with the questions. You didn't mention the farm workers unions. You didn't mention their role, if they have any, or how they're doing. I mean, I'm old enough, and many of us here in the audience remember Cesar Chavez and the great boycotts and all this kind of stuff. But I guess I'm a bit disappointed that you didn't seem to discuss any role, or it didn't seem like you were talking about any role for the farm workers unions, assuming they still exist. I do believe they do still exist. But
yes, I'm sorry I didn't mention. So I did work with the United Farm Workers Union. Their role in the community is not as prevalent now. They were one of when I'm speaking of these advocacy organizations, the UFW, there's the community organizations such as Mixteco Indígena Community Organizing Project, and the Central Coast Alliance United for Sustainable Economy. And so the union is still there. A lot of farm workers, there's only very few farm workers who are members of the union who receive those benefits.
Why is that? Why is that, Kaitlyn? Why is it such a why aren't basically all of the workers union members? Do you have any idea?
I think my indication from the conversation with farm workers is that many of them kind of are not interested in being part of the union, paying the dues, and then the growers are pushed back very heavily against the union as well. It's a very forceful pushback against any kind of unionization. And they have very strong kind of lawyers who really push back.
Yeah, okay. It was just sort of disappointing that they didn't seem to have a role after, as I say, many of us on this screen remember the great boycotts of what, 30, 40 years ago or whatever it was. Or maybe even longer than that. But in any case, thank you for that answer. Others with questions for Kaitlyn?
This reminds me of reading Rachel Carson's Silent Spring.
Mhm.
And it sounds like very little has changed. This was like in the 50s or early 60s, I believe. And it's also interesting that California has one of the strictest environmental sort of lists. Everything that goes into any manufactured ingredient has to be, if it has any kind of ingredient that's toxic, it has to be stated on the label. So there are some very interesting contradictions in this story. The other thing I was wondering about is, I assume that most of the farm workers do not have any sort of health insurance. Is that an accurate statement?
Yeah, they don't. Yeah, because they're undocumented, live in poverty. Many of them do not have health insurance. They only have access to, community-based clinics or grower-owned clinics as well.
So when they have acute pesticide toxicity and they have to go to the emergency department for treatment, do they wind up like having a huge bill? And how is that handled?
So I didn't get into kind of the bills as much in talking with the farm workers. Many of them who, I know personally, immigrants who don't have insurance may end up with hundreds of thousands in medical debt that they cannot pay back. And that can just, be debilitating for them, for their livelihoods. So, what I did learn with them kind of seeking out care, one of the other surprising things is that many physicians, even though, the symptoms that they're seeing are very well related to pesticides, they often don't link that. They are kind of hesitant to make that connection and hesitant to report that there's been a pesticide exposure. I think it's because there's that uncertainty between the cause and effect. And oftentimes farm workers said that they weren't even asked if some of the symptoms that they had, some of the kind of skin conditions that they had were related to pesticides. They're just kind of provided an ointment. They were never even asked kind of what their occupation was, and they didn't provide that information to the physician. Some other thing, the other things we talked about, we see, California as having some of the most strict regulations in regards to pesticide, a huge regulatory apparatus. You have the Department of Pesticide Regulation and also 58 kind of county agricultural commissioners who serve to enforce pesticide regulations. And it seemed to me in conducting the research, and I was kind of looking at kind of the discourse and the different claims that stakeholders were making, that the public officials and the regulators had some of the very same claims as the growers did. And they were really, their role was to kind of protect growers. And there wasn't as much enforcement going on. And there is some of their mandates are contradictory, right? The Agriculture Commission is there to kind of encourage agriculture, to support agriculture, and then also to enforce these pesticide laws.
conflict of interest.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And in regards to the risk assessment of pesticides, we're also conducting risk assessment of pesticide active ingredients and not taking into consideration these mixtures of pesticides that are applied in the fields, as well as the inactive ingredients. Oftentimes are also hazardous and they're not assessed. And again, with how much the farm workers are exposed to, it's really hard to pinpoint what pesticide or active ingredient might be causing the adverse health effect.
So one more question that may be a little bit outside of your ballpark, but are a lot of these pesticides like easily soluble in water? Because, we get the product, we rinse it, we feel like, we're safe.
Mhm.
But, if the pesticides are sort of in the fruits and the vegetables, then we're ingesting that stuff.
Right. Yeah, and there's definitely pesticide residues on a lot of the produce that we buy in the stores. I'd say, there's the dirty dozen. Strawberries are always high on the list because you can rinse it off, but the pesticides, right, are absorbed into the fruit itself. I think they say that after a certain amount of time, the pesticides are no longer toxic, but there's also it's difficult to understand the impact that those low dose of residues over time can have.
Great, thank you.
So
Priscilla?
Priscilla?
Yeah, okay.
I just wanted to comment too that the workers in these strawberry fields, they either move on to another crop and are
Mhm.
getting exposed to more pesticides, maybe different kinds, and they're just constantly being exposed throughout whatever they're picking and growing. And
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of the farm workers I spoke to had, worked in a variety of different industries, different agricultural products, and would be exposed therefore to different pesticides. And also a lot of them lived right with other farm workers in the home. And so they all kind of would come into the home tracking pesticides into the home. And my experience is that, there, as I mentioned in the talk, there's this long list of things that farm workers are meant to do. If you do all of these steps, then you're safe from pesticides. But that's things that I, didn't witness farm workers doing before they went into the home. Some farm workers would need to go pick up their children from the babysitter before they went home. There's so much that you have to do. You're working from 5 a.m. until, 6 p.m. and you have to go get the kids. They've been in school and daycare all day. You want to give them a hug. It's really difficult to follow some of those steps. And laundering apart, you have to go to the laundromat. There's just oftentimes not facilities in the home. So it's really infeasible to think that to expect or assume that farm workers are following those steps and can be safe.
And heaven forbid that the growers should provide those facilities for them before they leave the fields.
Right. I know that's the thing I always come back to and that no one talks about. I think it's because I'm sure they have reasons why, whether they own the land or they don't, and if they can put structures on the land for, showering. But it seems like straightforward that you would provide facilities for farm workers to decontaminate before they left the field.
Should be required.
Yeah. Kaitlyn, how much research is being done to look at the toxicity of all these pesticides? Are they doing animal studies? Are they doing how aggressive are people in studying this?
There's a lot of many different studies being conducted. One of the most famous studies, the Chamaco studies out of Salinas in California, has looked at the impact of our organophosphates on children's development, neural development. There's toxicology studies done on animals as well. My thought is that kind of more and more science might not necessarily be the answer. because we have this, I would say, kind of very clear suspicion that there's a need for precautionary measures, and the growers and their organizations are very good at kind of pinpointing uncertainties in all of the science, and the science has to be done in a particular way that it can have an impact on policies, and oftentimes it isn't. So there's a lot of research that shows that there is an impact and there's an effect, but it's not done in a way that can have a clear-cut impact on the regulations, right? Because maybe it didn't look at one specific pesticide or one specific active ingredient, but looked at all organophosphates, for example.
But it's interesting that I think this was back in the 50s or maybe the 60s. This came out of a laboratory in California from Bruce Ames. He had developed a test for carcinogenicity, and now all these products are tested for carcinogenicity. So I think that I think I agree with you that the science is there. It's just that there are the folks who don't want to listen to it are being enabled by the regulators and the enforcers.
Yeah.
Right.
Is there any effort to label products like strawberries that they may, there's no warning saying you should wash them thoroughly or that they could have absorbed, one of these chemicals?
I know we have labels on all of the organic produce, and that organic farmers have to go through a lot and spend a lot of money trying to get those labels before they can start reaping the benefits of it. So a lot of sustainable farms aren't able to get the organic label either. But I'm always curious, we need to have a label for kind of conventional agriculture. This has been used with, toxic pesticides. That I think that would definitely wake us up, definitely with our purchases. But like I said, I think that purchasing, voting with our dollars can only go so far. It's really important to kind of push for changes in regulation, because we might be able to move away from those fields and not live near toxic chemicals, not buy the produce. But that's where the kind of environmental injustice comes in, because those communities that can't, we have to push for change to protect those communities.
You're muted, Nancy.
Right. Yeah. Hi. I'm curious about how much progress we're making in alternatives to the toxic pesticides, birds or, other kinds of insects that I'm sorry, my battery's getting low. Where are we on all of that?
I think that there's a lot being done in alternative agriculture. It's not, my particular expertise. I kind of focus more on the conventional, but even just talking with the farm workers themselves, they're coming from communities in Mexico where they grew produce without any pesticides. And there's a lot even in Ventura County of alternative food being grown, and I think that it's definitely growing. But yeah, I need to do more research on that. I definitely should know that and have a better answer for that.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask a question? How do we get involved? What groups can we participate with to make change?
Yeah, so the groups that at the federal level, we have the Pesticide Action Network of North America, so that's continental level. At California, we have Californians for Pesticide Reform. At the county level, and actually, I think it's more state level in California, Líderes Campesinas is another group. The Central Coast Alliance United for a Sustainable Economy, and the Mesteco Indigenous Community Organizing Project. So I might be able to kind of come up with the list of organizations that we can support, and I can send that to Neil, and maybe he can share it with the group.
Right.
Because I think that that's, a really important way to have an impact. I think not only those who are working around pesticides, but also immigrant rights as well, empowering farm workers, increasing the minimum wage. Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like we're back to slavery, as you've described. It's not officially slavery, but it's pretty similar, and it's really abusive of these people.
Very exploitative, and they don't feel like they have a choice. I think that's the essential takeaway, that they really, are there. They feel that they don't have a choice because they need to provide for their families.
Becky, did you have a question?
I'm curious how you got into, what brought you to the research that you're now doing and where you see it going.
So I am from Ventura County, California. That's where I was born and raised. And as an undergraduate student, I was recruited onto a faculty student research project where we were conducting surveys in the community to learn more about local environmental problems and what the community members felt were their priorities, and seeing kind of the concern that they had around pesticide use, and going on to then also work with chemists who were looking at pesticide exposure through metabolites, and seeing that there was some in disparities in the exposure levels. And some of the women who worked on that project with me were from the communities, and they had a lot of knowledge kind of through their own background of the impact that it had on them and their families. So, I grew up in a part of the county that there's no agricultural fields, very suburban, just kind of residential homes, large kind of parks, national parks where I would go hiking. And I had no clue that my counterparts in other parts of the county were dealing with this. So learning more about that, I just felt really kind of like a responsibility and kind of passion for pursuing a career in environmental justice. And I want to continue to conduct research in California to there's some questions coming out of this dissertation research that I did that I want to continue pursuing. I think I had a lot of challenges in recruiting, for example, growers, and I'd really love to conduct more interviews with growers, because I spoke with a lot of farm workers, but just kind of understand how we might be able to implement some change through the growers themselves and kind of what their worldview is. I don't know how far that will take me, but just I think that, trying to speak with all of the stakeholders. And then I'm in, Boston now, and I there's not a huge farm worker population as far as I know. So I'm working with some researchers here more along climate justice and climate action, and thinking about kind of frontline communities in Boston, and trying to kind of network and get to know what the issues are here. And I know, urban agriculture is also important. It's great to hear that you're all learning about food, and so I know that there is going to be a community here to tap into as well with some of these passions that I have.
So I'm going to share a Northeastern story with you. So
Great.
the business, the College of Business, Demori Kim, they run a NSF-sponsored I-Corps program, which teaches scientists and engineers to commercialize their technology. And one of the successful ventures that is now doing very, very well is they're growing produce in a laboratory on an industrial scale with no pesticides, just the nutrients and appropriate hydration, and you know, the original sort of mission of this was to be able to create fresh, healthy food, you know, within the local area, because this could be transported, this could be reproduced anywhere in the country. But
Wow.
it's kind of the counterpoint to, you know, the experience that you're describing.
Absolutely. That's not, yeah, that's fascinating. I'll have to look more into that. Fascinating project.
Does anybody else have any more questions, or should we again thank Kaitlyn very much for her presentation?
Well, I'm curious about, I had never heard of something being identified as a wicked problem.
Yeah.
I know. I was
Hang on that.
But that's a Boston term.
oh, really?
No.
Well, we say wicked around here, but I like the way
Wicked
you
bad.
described it as having all these, well, you know, that it has so many implications and
Right,
tentacles going in every
complex.
direction, and it's just the weight of all of it seems like it's so intractable. So I'm
Right. It's a good term to explain the intractable nature of it. I know when I shared the kind of my work with other scholars who haven't been introduced to that term, they'll be like, I don't know if you should use such strong language. Or I was practicing my talk and my daughter was listening, and every time I'd say wicked, she'd start laughing and she's like, you said wicked problems in your talk. I was like, it's the term that they use in the scholarship. So that's funny. It's kind of like I don't even notice it anymore, that it's very colloquial.
oh yeah, it's really interesting. That's a whole nother dimension to
Yeah.
think about. Oh.
Well, all right. Thank you, Kaitlyn, very much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you so
Great.
much. That was really, really informative. And I agree with Neil. I'm throwing out all my strawberries. You know,
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, this is
Thank
really
you.
fantastic.
Caitlin, if
And
you could
yeah, the
hang
work
on
that
a
you're
minute.
doing is really important.
Kaitlyn, if you could hang on a minute, I'd like to chat with you just for a second.
Yeah, of course.
okay. And thank everybody
Thank
for
you.
coming. I appreciate.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kaitlyn.
Amy,
Thank
thank you for
you.
posting that, you know, on the, these Lane Lyceums, you know, and the thing. So appreciate your involvement in this too.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Okay.
Kaitlyn, are you familiar with Dick Daynard yet on campus? Do you know that
I'm
name?
not, no.
Dick Daynard is a law professor, a longtime law professor, and he was instrumental in suing the tobacco industry and winning the
Okay.
lawsuits against tobacco and the labeling and all that kind of stuff. So you might want to talk
Oh,
to him.
fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's so many overlaps between the tobacco industry story and this. So
Right. He was one of the lead lawyers on that. And so he's very much interested in economic justice and as it relates to